Well, good evening, folks. Good evening. A warm welcome to this evening of Q&A, question and answers with Andy Bannister. We're very pleased to welcome Andy back to Inverness.
Back to Inverness, yeah.
Andy is director of the Solus Centre for Public Christianity, based in Dundee, with workers stationed around the UK. Some of you will be familiar with Andy's, in case you're not. He has written a couple of books, one called The Atheist Who Didn't Exist, and the first chapter is called The Loch Ness Monster's Moustache, so very relevant to this area.
Very relevant.
And then a second book on do Muslims and Christians worship the same God?
Loch Ness Monster does not turn up in that one.
Okay.
Okay,
no Loch Ness Monster in the second.
No.
Both well worth reading. Excellent books. It is a question and answer, so it's really up to ourselves. This could be a very short meeting, or it could be as long as you like. But we will take a recap. We'll stop in about an hour's time and see how things are going, and then if we want to push on, that's fine. If anybody wants to leave, that's also fine. I think that's all. Well, one more thing. There's some free literature here on this table by the door on an Easter-related theme. We're not that far away from Easter, so if anything there takes your interest or would be of interest to someone you know, then please do take from whatever is there on the table by the door. Now, before tonight, a few folks who belong to the congregation of Highland International Church had written a few questions for Andy in advance. So I thought I would ask one of those questions to get us going, maybe one or two of them, but then we'll open it up to yourselves, to questions on any kind of topic. Although someone did ask me about the next manager of Manchester United. I said there are some questions that maybe not, maybe you know. So here's the first question, okay? People have said to me, you don't need to go to church to be Christian. So what would your answer be? What would your answer be?
A good question. Of course, the first thing I'd say, it's fascinating that question coming in the context of an event organised by Highland, because in a sense you guys don't meet in a church, you meet in a hotel, so you can go to a hotel and be a Christian.
Yeah.
Right. And but rather than that rather obvious kind of get out, I think it's interesting. I want to say both yes and no to this. I mean, obviously, if you read the Bible, read the New Testament, especially what Jesus had to say about what it means to be a follower of Him, absolutely, you can just be. The most important thing is how we stand as human beings in a relationship to Jesus, in a relationship with the God who made us. So in one sense, that is just an us and God thing. So in one sense, the answer to the question I would initially say is, well, there's a degree of yes to it, but here's the problem. It's far too easy. It's far too easy to sit and be a follower of Jesus in your bedroom. Shut the door, shut the world out. By the way, you need to shut the world out, not just the church out, because it's very easy to love other people if there are no other people. It's very easy, not to have anyone draw attention to perhaps some of your annoying little habits that maybe actually you do need Jesus to work on in your life if you're not encountering others. And I think one of the things about church is firstly, it encourages you because you're following Jesus in community. Second, we need, if we are followers of Jesus, we need other Christians around us that knock the edges off us. I've only spent less than the last 24 hours with James. He's probably already seen a number of edges he'd love to get the sledgehammer to in me, and boy, I've got a list with him. So we can encourage and strengthen one another. But very seriously, there's another beautiful thing about church, which is one of the things about following Jesus, a sign actually that you are a genuine Jesus follower, and that actually His Spirit is at work in your life, is that actually you find yourself gravitating towards other people because they're followers of Jesus like you are, despite the fact outwardly they are very, very different. And when the church is functioning functioning properly and as it should, recognize it doesn't always function as it should, but when it functions as it should, you should be able to look around a church and see, gosh, here are people whose socio-economic status is different, who wouldn't otherwise meet. These are people whose politics is very different. Somebody actually recently pointed out, in today's society, it's interesting to ask the question, where is it that young folks and older people meet together if it's not a family context? The answer is there isn't anywhere. But when the church is functioning as it should, there should be young and there should be old. And even more radically, quite frankly, if you are a Christian, when you are in church on Sunday, if your church is functioning normally, you should look around you and there should be people in the same building as you, even in the same row of seats as you, who would actually be your mortal enemies were it not for the fact that Jesus has brought you together. And none of those things can be experienced, lived out, or seen if you try and follow Jesus in isolation. So yeah, it's not a case that Jesus says, right, follow me, you first got to join the church, but I think you become a very kind of weak, quite feeble kind of Christian if you try and do it on your own. So I would say, in that sense, the answer to the question, you do need the church, even though the church can sometimes be full of annoying people, just like me and just like you.
Very much. Any follow-up questions to that, or even just another question from the floor? Amy? Oh, hold on a minute, Amy. We've got a microphone for you here. Joshua, I should have said, Joshua's going to hand around the microphone.
Thanks, Joshua, and thanks. Go for it, Amy.
I know committed Christians who don't bother becoming a member of a church. They just kind of go along.
Yeah.
And never become a member, and it's not important to them. Do you think it is important to become a member in a church?
There's a great question, Amy. This is, again, a question to which I'd want to say both yes and no. Let me start with the no. The reason why, on one hand, I want to say it's not important in one sense is, of course, different churches operate different systems of membership. I grew up in a sort of in the Baptist tradition. You don't have to be a Baptist to go to heaven, but why take chances? My motto. Where membership was quite an important thing. I've equally been in churches where there was no membership system at all whatsoever. So the actual act of becoming a member of the church that you're in, if your church operates a membership system, I personally hold that lightly. What I do think is important, absolutely important for those of us who want to be followers of Jesus, is to commit to the congregation that we're in, to actually have skin in the game, as people might say, because otherwise it's very easy to be a consumer and just go, well, I'm going to this church right now, I quite like it. Oh, no, now they've changed the pastor and the music's different. You know what, I don't like anymore, I'm going to go to this one. And you know what, actually I've discovered the biscuits here are not as good as the cupcakes here. And if we're not careful, we cruise around and we never go deep. And that connects to that first question. There's something about church being a place where we're deep. There's an authenticity. We let people see us as who we really are. We really invest. We really commit. And equally, because if the church is serving the community well, there's something about committing into the community that we're part of, and people going, oh gosh, these Christians are really invested, not just fly-by-nights. So whether or not that involves actual membership, I think depends on the church that you're in, as long as, if you are a Jesus follower and attending a church, you are properly committed, really invested, and not just here today, gone tomorrow. So I hope that helps. That was a bit of a yes and a bit of a no. So I hope that wasn't too sort of vague. That's good, thank you.
Here's another question we got previously, slightly different topic. How would you answer those who say that believing the Bible makes us bigots, or makes people into bigots, people who believe the Bible are bigots?
Well, the first thing I think I'd say, I'm a great believer in the power of questions, actually. And I spend a lot of my time addressing very hostile audiences. I mean, you look like a very friendly, relatively friendly audience tonight, but sometimes I have to address Methodists. And and so the first thing I'd say, I think if someone said that to me, and I actually, I do a lot of events on university campuses, you get some very challenging questions. I've never actually had anyone come right out and say that particular phraseology. If I did, I think my first response would be, okay, well, can you give me some evidence for that? That's a great question if someone challenges you. And if you're someone here this evening who doesn't have a Christian faith, and you have some objections to Christianity, it's a good question to ask yourself. Okay, I have this perception, I have this objection. What's my evidence for it? Because I think all of us, whether we're Christians or we're not, have to be able to give reasons for what we believe. The first thing I'd say is I think, what's the evidence for that? Because actually, as I said in the previous answer, the church can sometimes be messed up and broken. We're going to talk a bit about that on Sunday morning when I speak at Highland. Christians can sometimes mess a few things up, but overall, I'm hugely impressed as I have the privilege of travelling up and down the country across Scotland and into England and Wales and Ireland. Actually, in most cases, I have the privilege of seeing churches that are working really hard, serving their communities, doing their best. They don't always get it right, but really, working hard to make a difference. In fact, it's been calculated, actually. If you took all the churches out of the UK, it would add billions to the social care costs, because all the work that's done by churches would then have to be picked up by others. So my first question would be, what's the evidence for that? Probably, now I'm beginning to guess, because I'm not dialoguing with the person who's asked that, they would mean, because the Bible teaches things about sexuality. For example, the Bible says that God's design for sexuality is one man, one woman in committed marriage. And so doesn't that exclude, our friends who are perhaps, lesbian or gay, or have structured their lives in other ways? That might be what's meant. To which I would then follow up and say, well, disagreeing with somebody, if it's done in a way that's kind and compassionate and generous, does not make somebody a bigot. Doesn't make somebody a bigot. I have many, many Muslim friends, because my academic background, although I'm a Christian, is studying the Quran. That's my academic area of research. Many, many Muslim friends. My Muslim friends profoundly disagree with my beliefs. I would never turn around to them and go, well, you're a bigot because you don't think Christians are right. I'd go, okay, they think something different to me. And we've had some really healthy, hearty conversations. And I think it's important that as Christians, for those of us who want to follow Jesus and therefore take the Bible seriously, the Bible teaches some things that are not believed by wider society. That doesn't exactly surprise me, funnily enough. The question is whether we can then talk about those things in a way that is friendly and welcoming and inclusive. And one of the things I find interesting about Jesus never turned anybody away. Jesus radically welcomed people, no matter what their starting point, no matter how far from whom they were. He welcomed them as they were. He loved them as they were. And as they came into a relationship with him, some things changed. So he didn't start by saying, first sort your life out, then you can come. He said, come, and then see what happens. And then one last thing I would add to this, and then maybe there'll be a follow-up question. What I find interesting is that when you look at what the Bible teaches, particularly around sexuality, but also around some of the related issues, it cuts and contradicts different cultures in different places, which is interesting, because if God was going to send a book like the Bible that's going to speak to all times and places, you would expect different cultures in different times and places to find different things challenging. So interestingly, here in the West, the thing that people often find challenging when they read the Bible is the Bible's sexual ethic that I've described. But equally, the same people who would disagree with that would love what the Bible says about human value and dignity. Human rights law and theory here in the West is actually based upon the biblical idea that every human being has value and dignity. So we like that thing, we don't like the other thing. Go to the East, or go to places like Asia and China and India. What you tend to find, actually particularly pressing to somewhere like China, you'll find that there's a lot of disagreement about what the Bible says about human rights and value, because it's a very collectivist society, and the idea that individual value, humans have dignity, doesn't sit very well. On the other hand, many of those countries love the Bible's sexual ethic, although if anything, they think it doesn't actually go quite far enough. And so I find that absolutely fascinating, that the point of challenge is different in different cultures. And that's sobering, because again, in the West, we like to think we are the bee's knees, that our ideas on ethics and marriage and sexuality, well, everybody thinks that way. Well, actually, everyone doesn't think that way. And it also shouldn't surprise us that the Bible therefore challenges us things. And I actually think culturally, it's the place where the Bible challenges us that we need to listen most carefully. If we're simply people who read the Bible, whether we are Christians or tire kickers, come to look at the Christian vehicle, walk around it and look at it, if we're only going to look at the Bible and go, well, the bits that agree with me, I like that, and the bits that disagree with me, I'm not going to have. Well, actually, my friends, you've just made yourself God in God's place and gone, I'm now going to sit in judgment on the Bible, rather than actually sit back and go, okay, maybe I'll let it say a few things. Okay. So, long answer, but it was an important question. Yeah. So I hope whoever asked that, I've said a couple of things that might be helpful.
Yeah. Any questions on the back of that? Picking up any issues? I thought that was very helpful. We'll go for another. Anybody want to ask any other questions just at the moment? Okay, David.
So this is it's a sort of related but slightly different. It relates to you talking about us as a certain type of audience.
Yes.
But it got me thinking about the audience that I'm often speaking with I'm a teacher, so the staff room is my place to hang out and be chatting with colleagues.
Yes.
And whenever faith has come up in relation to myself,
Mhm.
and conversation goes a bit deeper, it quite often finishes along the lines of, well, that is good for you, David. I'm glad that you have got that. And it can be a variety of different things. It can be, that is your truth, and I've got my truth, or I'm so pleased for you. So it feels like that's the end of the conversation. We're not going to go any further.
Yeah.
We're smiling. We're all good
We're all friends
here.
yeah.
And of course, I see that person the next day and the next week and so on.
Yes.
Any
Yeah.
tips on how to respond to that?
Well, the first thing is that I'm glad that your colleagues have picked up that you're a person of faith, David, because sometimes for those in the room, because I'm conscious not everybody here may have a Christian faith, but for those of us who do, it can be tempting to hide that faith away at work. And I think the first step, actually, for those of us who are followers of Jesus who are in secular workplaces, find ways of signaling that you are. One of the easiest, actually, is just when the conversation comes around to what you did on the weekend. Many of us, if we're honest, who are followers of Jesus, who are a bit nervous, and I used to be like this in the workplace, we fluff those conversations, oh yeah, I played footy on Saturday, went to a great movie, went to Sunday morning, and then saw some friends on Sunday afternoon. Don't do that. Just talk positively. Go, played footy on Saturday, great movie on Saturday evening. Oh, fantastic church service on Sunday. The pastor was amazing, and if he was, and even if he wasn't.
No.
And yes, anyway, but you've done that. So the next thing I would say, what do you teach, David? What subject? Right. Okay.
Do you want to repeat that? No, one or Andy can repeat that.
Because otherwise we misheard you. We heard
Yeah.
that as religious amoral education, which is a whole different subject entirely.
So, this is irrelevant.
Good.
My subject is religious moral education,
Good.
but for the last 10 years, I've been a guidance teacher, so
Right.
pastoral support.
Yeah.
And so I teach a whole number of
Yeah.
different subjects, which is often
Right.
a good lead-in to interesting
Yes.
conversations.
Brilliant.
So,
Okay.
you get the idea.
Good. What I think I would do is a couple of things there you could do. I think I'm a great believer in the sort of question asking approach, if you can generate some questions, but also being a little bit provocative and a little bit cheeky. If you do it with a glint in your eye and a smile, you can get away with it. So, for example, if I was in your shoes and somebody said the whole kind of, your truth, my truth thing, I think I'd start by going, it's right, you affirm that. For example, when I teach the kids, when we're teaching on morality, I'm very clear to them, look, I believe it's wrong to murder. But if you want to murder somebody, that's okay. That's your truth. It's important that the kids understand that. Wouldn't you agree? Now, I suspect your fellow teacher is not going to agree with that statement. You quite deliberately want it because you're being quite naughty and pushing them. The other thing you could do is bring it into their own subject. If you're talking to someone who's a maths teacher, for example, I think I might say, hey, when it comes to, just out of interest, when it comes to mathematical truths, with all due respect, do you apply what you've just said there in the classroom? Do you teach the children well? For some of us, our truth is that 2 + 2 is 4. Others may have different mathematics and different truths, and that's fine. And when we grade your exams, we'll recognise that.
That would have been helpful, actually.
Because it will probably get a smile. Don't do it with a kind of gotcha. Do it with a kind of because what you're trying to do, you can see what I'm trying to do, right? Get them to go. There's something about truth by its nature is external to us. Truth is we go out there and we discover it. The mountain is either there or it isn't. The truth is either there or it isn't. But we've obviously moved into an age where truth has become interiorized. It's all around feelings. And I think the best way to address that is just call that out. And so either with your own subject or with theirs, I would do that. And it's amazing how quickly you can find bedrock. One of my favorite examples of this, in fact, I told this story in my new book that comes out next year, that a friend of mine who was a high school student at the time, she was about 17, 18, she had a friend of hers in class who she would try and share her faith with, and it would always get onto this subject of your truth, my truth, even around morality. She tried morality. She even tried the Hitler line, which often works, going, do you think Hitler did was wrong? And her friend was like, well, no, I couldn't say what he did was wrong, because everyone's truth is their truth, even the Nazis. And this, my friend, well, she wasn't my friend at the time, when I met her at a conference, she said, give me some advice, what can I say? And I said to her, well, try this. Next time this happens, reach over and steal your friend's phone or coffee cup, whatever it is, something of hers, take it during the conversation. And to make this work, you just need to carry the conversation on. Because what you want is your friend to go, what were you doing? Then you say, I'm taking your phone. Now, you were saying, what do you mean you're taking my phone? Yeah, I'm taking your phone. Now, carry on. You were saying, hang on, give me my phone back. Oh, hang on a moment. Are you saying it's wrong to steal somebody's phone? That may be your truth. It's not my truth. Now, what you were saying, trust me, your friend will find moral bedrock really quickly. And this is what happened. Praise the Lord, I got an email a few days later with her saying, I tried it, and it was with a coffee cup. She'd stolen her coffee, and even take a swig out of it, and her friend had lost it totally, and suddenly realised that actually there is such a thing as truth. Because statements like your truth, my truth, sound lovely in the real world. In the theoretical world, they don't work in the real world. I mean, what does it mean to say that Putin's truth is it's okay to invade Ukraine, and it's the Ukrainians' truth that it isn't? That's the first thing. On the faith thing, the kind of I like your faith kind of thing, there I think I would be more inclined to say, yeah, I think my faith is absolutely crucial to me. It gives me meaning, it gives me hope, it gives me a basis for human rights. It's what tells me we are not just the particles of which we are made, but we're far more than that. It's the basis for education, because I believe that knowing stuff and finding truth out really matters. That's a profoundly Christian view. All that stands on my faith. You, I assume from the way you phrase the question, don't have any faith. So what functions in that place in your life? What gives you the basis for human rights and dignity? What gives you the grounding idea that pursuing truth is a good thing? What gives you hope? Turn the tables and press into them. And because I think what you'll find very quickly is there's not a lot there. Actually, human rights is the big one. I mean, I occasionally come into schools and do guest, moral or RE lessons, and the one I'll often do is the human rights one. And what I've done over the years is I'll usually start the class by just, sharing an illustration of some particular human rights atrocity. Right now it's, Ukraine is the piece of low-hanging fruit in the news, and then just say to the students, okay, put your hand up here if you think what I described was on the screen is wrong. And unless you've got a psychopath in the class, which doesn't often happen, all the hands go up. And then that follow-up question, well, okay, why is it wrong? And that usually turns into, maybe you've done similar things, becomes fascinating. Because really without God, there is no basis for human rights and dignity. And I think if you can get people to that point, then I think you can get people to go, okay, faith, quite a lot matters actually, in terms of faith. It's not just a private thing. A lot stands in it. So that's sort of how I would go, David. I'd push those two conversations that way. One, I'd ask some questions. The other, I'd be a little bit cheeky and edgy and see if I could get a reaction. Does either of those, does that help a little bit? Yeah, it's fun. It's actually, I think sometimes we can take ourselves too seriously, and to have a little bit of fun and tease slightly. Don't be rude, just tease slightly. And sort of go, I don't think, with respect, it doesn't work, does it? To me, the win is that the person you're talking to goes, oh, yes, yes, exactly. It's truth does matter. You are very welcome. I look forward to hearing of great successes or you getting fired. I will find out which is which. I'm sure the latter won't happen.
Yeah. Any questions from the floor? Anybody? Kathleen?
Kathleen?
Could you unpack that a wee bit more?
Yes.
Why do we have to have God to have a basis for human rights?
Fantastic. Yeah, great question. Happily unpack that, Kathleen. First thing I'd say is it's actually not controversial. There's been lots of writing done on human rights and the basis for human rights, because human rights is based on the idea that you and everyone around you have inherent value and dignity. It's not based upon your age or your gender or your ability or your race. There's nothing about you that means you have human rights. You have human rights, you have value, you have dignity because you're a human being. That very quickly raises the natural question, why? And actually many atheist writers who've sort of studied the history of human rights, as a wonderful French atheist writer called Luc Ferry, who has written a brilliant book called A Brief History of Thought. And he's got a lovely chapter in there on human rights, where even though he is adamant he doesn't believe in God, he has lots of problems with the church and Christianity, it's in the heart of that chapter, he says, we forget the fact that in the ancient world, and in most societies, it was taken as a given that there was a scale of value. At the top were men, then you had women, then you had slaves, then you had children. That was obvious to the Greeks, that was obvious to the Romans, that was obvious to the Persians, obvious the whole of classical antiquity. And then along comes Christianity and turns the world upside down, his words, with this idea that actually, no, everybody has equal value. And he said that is an idea that didn't come from nowhere. It's an idea to which I am profoundly grateful to Christianity. And as he unpacks that, the issue is, if there is no God, if we live in a godless universe, Kathleen, you are nothing more than a collection of atoms and particles. As the atheist astrophysicist Lawrence Krauss put it memorably, you are a 1% bit of pollution. Well, we are a 1% bit of pollution in the universe, not you personally, but humanity. We are just a collection of bits and pieces that will revert to that eventually. And turning around and saying, well, this collection of atoms has inherent value and dignity, whereas this collection of atoms doesn't, is nonsensical. There is no conceivable way that makes sense unless something has conferred this collection, sorry to refer to you in this, this collection of atoms with value and dignity. And in the very first page of the Bible, Genesis chapter 1, verse 26, we read this amazing verse where it says that God created human beings in his own image. In the image of God, he created them, male and female, he created them. And the founders, actually, of human rights theory, if you trace where it began, the story of human rights is interesting. It actually begins in the 16 and 1700s, maybe a fraction a little bit earlier, actually, when the Spaniards were colonizing South America. And there was horrific brutality, as there were in a lot of the colonial powers. And word gets back to the King of Spain of what's going on, the way colonists are being treated. He convenes a panel, a committee of jurists and theologians to try and figure out how some of the worst excesses can be stopped. And it's actually out of their deliberations that they land on Genesis 1 and bring out this idea that no, everybody, including the natives, who to European eyes were not considered human. It's shocking to hear that language now. And the same thing then applies, you trace that right down through the civil rights movement, Martin Luther King and those fighting for the rights of African Americans, all go back to this idea. So that's where it goes back to. That's the ultimate question. Are you just a very pretty collection of atoms and particles, or are you more than that? And if you want to say you have rights and dignity, you have to be more than that. Otherwise, you are worth no more than the table in front of you. I hope that helps a little bit. Yeah.
Something similar. I know you're familiar with Tom Holland's book, Dominion. Tom actually book on Christianity and Muslims.
He has. That was amazing.
Yeah. And that book, Dominion, where he came in the first few pages, he came to the realization that what he had assumed were Western values were actually had nothing to do with antiquity, nothing to do with Rome or Greece, but all to do with Christianity. And that you've taken a specific example of that, of human rights, that he takes a book to unfold the impact of how Christianity has impacted our culture.
Yeah.
Let me ask another question on the
Yes.
question. If heaven is a place of happiness and those we love are not there, they're close family and friends, will that not make it a place of sadness as well? How do we deal with that?
That's a really good question, and because I'm a great believer in taking questions where you can make them tougher and making them tougher, there's another side to that question, of course, because I've heard the other side of that question. There's that version, which is, if I am in heaven in eternity with Jesus in the age to come, and there are loved ones who are not there, that's tough. The flip side of it is, what if I'm somebody who's experienced horrific injustice at the hands of somebody, and that person has become a follower of Jesus? God has dealt with the evil and the justice in their life and has forgiven them and shown them justice and mercy, and there in heaven is the person who victimized me in this life. So there's actually two sides to this, which are almost equal and opposite. One side of the objection is, well, God's not generous enough. He doesn't let enough people in. And the flip side of the question is, God's too generous. He lets the wrong sort of people in, which is interesting. Let me say just a couple of things. Well, I should say three things. First thing is, we should have said this at the start, actually, James. I would not want to give you the impression that and he may answer the odd question too. He did promise me he'd answer the odd question as well. Don't get the impression just because we happen to be the bloke sitting in the front that we know everything. Some things we can offer some wisdom on. Some things we can't, because if humanity knew everything about the ways of God, we'd have a God who is very tiny and fits in a box. There are some things we don't know. And around this question, there are aspects of this question I don't fully know the answer to. I want to begin saying that before I tease things out a little bit. Second thing I want to say, it's also just helpful. It's not hugely essential, but I think it's helpful. I think it's important how we define words. And we talk about heaven. The perception I think a lot of people have who don't have a Christian faith, and even actually many Christians stumble into this, is the heart of Christianity is the idea that you become a follower of Jesus, you sort of pray some magic prayer, and then when you die, you get to float upstairs and spend eternity on a cloud next to a chubby angel playing a harp and have a great big party in the sky. Whatever the heck that is not classic Christian faith. Because the Bible's vision is infinitely bigger than that. The Bible's vision is actually that God is going to renew and restore the whole of creation, not just those who follow Christ, but actually creation itself, because it doesn't take a rocket scientist to look around and go, something has gone wrong with this good world, this universe. And actually the whole of creation is going to be restored. And the Bible, rather than use the language of heaven, uses the language of new heavens and new earth. And there's going to be a physical quality to that if you read books like the book of Revelation in the New Testament and talk around that. So it's a much bigger vision than just this idea of sort of floating around in heaven. In fact, one of the best descriptions of it, funnily enough actually, because we've just gone through this with my kids, if you are a lover of stories and fiction and fantasy, C.S. Lewis's famous books, the Narnia books, which take the Christian faith and try and express them in sort of narrative and fiction form. The Last Battle and its vision of what the renewed Narnia is going to be like. Lewis is just playing off the book of Revelation in the New Testament, and it's a beautiful description, I think, of what it will be like. Where the grass in the new heavens is more grassy, the mountains are more mountainy, everything is more real and more, with all of the sin and evil and death removed. So let's get the bigger vision piece. Why I think that is actually important is at the heart of that vision as well is not that heaven's going to be a great party in the sky, but heaven is going to be profoundly relational. When I wrote this book last year, Do Muslims and Christians Worship the Same God? One of the things I went through a lot of places where the Quran, the scripture of Islam, and the Bible may use the same language, but have profoundly different ideas behind that language. And one of them is God. The idea of God is a very different construct in Islam. And one of the big differences with the God of Islam, and you see it very clearly when you read the Quran as someone who's either, if you're a follower of Jesus, or you know a little bit about the Bible, is that the God of the Bible is a relational God. From the moment he created human beings, he created us for a relationship with him. In fact, in the Genesis story in the Old Testament, as soon as God has created everything, he steps into creation and walks and talks with Adam and Eve. God takes on flesh in the person of Jesus and walks and talks with us. And God is going to walk and talk with us in the new heavens and the new earth. It will be a relationship. It will be a close relationship, not a case of God going, great, there's the party room, there are the balloons, have some fun. But actually, it will be an eternity of getting to know God better and better and better every day. What, therefore, I think that will mean? I think if there is a hint of sadness at somebody not being there, if there is a hint of at somebody being there, that may be there at first. I do think some of that suffering and some of those questions may initially get carried over, but I think it will soon evaporate in the light of what it means to fall closer and closer in love with God and enjoy his presence. It's not that God says it's not important, but that actually in the light of what it means to see God face to face rather than through a distance, it will become a thing that we forget as God wipes away. In fact, it says in Revelation, God will wipe away every tear from our eye, which implies there may be some tears at first, but God will be the one there to heal those and deal with those once and for all. That has an element of I don't know fully how that maps out. But I don't think the Bible ever plays fast and loose with these kind of questions. It recognizes them. But at the heart of it, what excites me about heaven is that presence of God intimately and closely once again. And that's why, as someone who's a Christian, I want to share that faith with others. It's not about me wanting to, notch up, victories. Now, people believe the same as I do. I think a relationship with Jesus is the best news ever now and certainly in what's to come. I would want as many of my friends as possible and family to discover that too.
Thank you.
Would you add anything to that?
No.
I suppose just to be cheeky and not let you get away with it. I was going to say, I come at this question. I'm a writer, I'm a philosopher, I'm a thinker, I'm a communicator. That's kind of what I do. You're a pastor, so I know. You might have someone ask you that more. Is there a pastoral component to that I have missed that would be worth touching on?
The thing that came to mind just as you were speaking is the vision that Job gets at the end of the book of Job. For those of you not familiar with the story of Job, the man went through so much suffering and so many questions. It's a slightly different context, but questions of meaning and purpose and destiny. And at the end of all the questions and the struggles and the wishing that he had never been born, never seen the light of day, and Job's comforters, which have passed into English language, not being much comfort at all. At the end, he gets a vision of God that effectively makes Job put a hand over his mouth and say, I have nothing to say, no more questions. The vision of the greatness and the glory of God have just blown those questions away. So I tend to think that when we see the glory of the Lamb who was slain for us, and even in the Bible, when you have stories of the glory of Jesus, something of the heavenly glory being revealed, even with angelic people, humans tend to fall flat on their face. That's their response. So I tend to think that these questions will melt away when we see Jesus. Any Joe, wake up.
Oh. Go, Joshua.
Thank you, Josh. Yeah, on
Lizzie. There you go.
Well done.
In terms of if there are levels, I'm going to use the word language level. Oh, sorry, Eliana.
Oh,
sorry.
She's got a question.
If there are levels, I'm going to use that language, although I don't know if that's right, of heaven and hell, how does that then relate to having a faith that's not based on works? And also, how does that relate to God viewing sin equally if there are various levels of punishment and things? Does that question make sense?
It does, yeah. That's a good question. I guess I would say, as I read the Bible, I don't think there are levels in heaven in that sense. I mean, there's certainly, you go read like Dante. Dante played with the idea of the seven. He had 7 levels of heaven and hell, didn't he? But I think that's a like medieval art idea. There is definitely the idea of reward in there. The Bible does talk about crowns, doesn't it? That some get a sort of crown when they arrive in heaven. And interesting, one of the images, that's one of the places that's applied to, of course, is people who've suffered and been martyred for their belief in Christ. And so that's far more not a kind of what they've done in terms of moral effort, as in what it's cost them. Because I think Jesus and I think God takes very seriously those who have paid that ultimate price for following Him. And I'm always very struck when I had the privilege of traveling, that for all of how hard it can be to be a Christian in this country, and it can be very hard. Travel to the East and meet people who've actually paid through imprisonment and or family members they've lost. I think that's a very serious thing. I think God takes that very seriously. But I don't think there's a level idea. I don't think it's a case of you get to heaven and you go, and God will go, okay, Lizzie, you're in the you're in this suite here, and James, you're upstairs. I don't think that is the case, because I think the Bible repeatedly stands so much against the idea of effort that I think it so counters to everything that Jesus stood for in his message repeatedly. Incidentally, for a couple of very good reasons. I think sometimes if we are Christians or we've grown up around the church, we've heard this kind of language, I think we can forget the importance of it. Firstly, of course, if effort was involved in being welcomed into God's family, humans being humans, we'd start looking down on each other. We'd start going, well, of course, I'm better than him, and I'm not as good as her. We have a natural tendency to compare with each other. And one of the beautiful things about Christianity, it just cuts that whole idea off at the knees. With God go, it's not to do with you, it's to do with me. Come on in. The first thing. The other thing, of course, if the Christian faith and acceptance by God are based on effort, the other thing you could never do is never be secure, because you would never know. You could always do more. You could always do more. You can always work harder, keep more laws, perform morally more. And, you know, I'm struck that we live in this increasingly actually an age where that stands out, because we live in an age of performance-based acceptance. We live in a society that says your acceptance is based on how you perform. Say the wrong thing on social media and you're out of there. You know, your grades don't measure up at university. You know, you're out of there if you don't measure up at work. Performance, performance, performance. And in this age where everything is performance based, the gospel cuts across that. Jesus going, it's not about performance. Not about performance. My yoke is easy, my burden is light, said Jesus. So yeah, I don't think there are levels in heaven. The nearest is that imagery of crowns, but I think that's a very specific setting that's addressed to. Would you add anything to that?
Yeah, I would just, the passages come to mind. Paul talks in Corinthians about people who will be saved through the fire. You know, if what they've built has been made of wood, hay, and straw, it'll be burned up, and they will be saved, but almost, as it were, by the skin of their teeth, which again is language that's you could misunderstand it. We're all saved by grace, as you say. It's level ground in terms of our acceptance by God. But there's no doubt, I think there, not just in Paul's talk in Corinthians, even Jesus, in the parable of the sheep and the goats, there's no doubt that our works in some way, whether that is our crown. But I think the important thing is to realize there'll be no sense of loss in heaven. Everyone will be perfectly satisfied with whatever our treasure or reward is, because ultimately the treasure is Christ. I don't know, but certainly it's one of those questions where I think there are enough passages to talk about that, particularly that one in 1 Corinthians 3 where it talks about, say, you know, if it's a challenge to me as a pastor, if I build something with cheap materials, if it's not, it'll not last. Whereas if I do build, or we build as a church with costly materials, with gold and silver and precious stones, that is something that will last to eternity. That means, I'm not exactly sure, but that teaching is there.
Oh, I like that. And of course, actually, the other teaching of Jesus that I was reminded of, because I think in all of this, it's great to bring it back to Christ. Of course, is the parable of the Jesus told about the guy who goes out to hire workers, you know, for his vineyard, and goes out at the start of the day, hires some, goes out at noon, hires some more, goes at the middle of the afternoon, there's still blokes standing around, haven't been hired. Jesus hires them. The guy hires them, and of course, at the end of the parable, the vineyard owner pays the same wage to all of them. And of course, the ones who've been hired at 3 p.m. are like, "Oh, what's going on, mate? We've been, you know," the ones at 9 a.m. rather, "We've been working all day. These guys got hired an hour ago." And the vineyard owner's like, "Well, you know, I can be gracious to who I show grace to." And I think that to me is so beautifully the gospel in a nutshell as well. Like you say, some of us, you know, been slaving away, working hard since 9 a.m. Some of us skin of our flipping teeth. But actually, you know, when we're welcomed into God's family, I don't think God then shows favourites and goes, "Yeah, you were the skin of the teeth. You're the skin of the teeth table. You're the table over here." Hope that helps a little bit. Yeah. Oh, gotcha. I'd say there's a couple of things I think are important here. This is a great question. I mean, firstly, in terms of levels, I think that's probably more of a medieval arts idea. The big idea, the controlling metaphor in the New Testament. Well, actually, first thing in the New Testament, of course, is important. Sometimes we can end up thinking the New Testament is a heaven and hell story. It's actually not. Hell is mentioned a tiny number of times. Heaven mentioned hundreds of times. The Bible, actually, someone described the Bible, this is Glenn Scrivener, who's a friend of ours. So the Bible is actually, the New Testament is more of a heaven and earth story. It's about heaven and earth being reunited and the hell being thrown out of God's good creation. But where hell is mentioned, the controlling metaphor is one of separation. That's the big idea that runs through all the images in the New Testament. The hell is a place where you are utterly separated from God. Everything that was good, everything that stood upon God, goodness and beauty, all gone. It's the total absence of anything that is of God in any shape or form. And I can't think of anything more terrifying, quite frankly. The outer darkness is the image that Jesus used in a number of places. I mean, absolutely sort of bone-chilling image when you think that through. It's not a place you'd ever want to to go. I don't think with something of that terror, one needs to think about levels, and it's not as if there's a whole series of little demons working on you in different levels. I think the punishment is that you've, in a sense, chosen the outer darkness, and in fact C.S. Lewis famously described the door to hell being locked on the inside, because sadly some people are there because they want nothing to do with God and they've got what they wished. What I would say though, Christians can sometimes get a little bit too cocky here and go, well, every sin is essentially the same, and whether you've stolen a packet of paper clips from W.H. Smith's or killed hundreds of people in a land war in Ukraine, it's all sin, and the outcomes. I don't think that is biblical. I think there is lots of language about how God views the weak, the poor, orphans, widows, children. There is lots of language about God bringing justice. I think before the door is slammed on the outer darkness, Christians believe all will stand before God, all will be held for account. Those of us who are followers of Christ will walk into the new heavens and the new earth, not because of our performance, because Jesus has dealt with that stuff. Others will stand there and face the full wrath, what they have done. And I don't think God on that day will be going, yeah, packet of paper clips, genocide is the same. I think God takes sin very, very seriously, especially when it damages those that he loves and has created in his image. The Bible has some incredibly strong words around that. So yeah, I would not play fast and loose with that myself. I don't think that translates into sort of levels in hell, but it does translate into God ensuring there will be justice. And the resounding message to me of Scripture is some words the Bible, in the Old Testament we see on the lips of Abraham when Abraham says, "Will not the judge of all the earth do right?" And that is the story of God's dealings with sin and evil and redemption. Nobody will stand before God and go, "Oh well, I got off scot-free, or that person got off scot-free, or that wasn't fair." That's where we're all heading. And as I say, it makes me deeply grateful for what Christ has done for me, because I think as human beings we deceive ourselves. Very easy to go, well, of course, if there were levels in heaven or hell, where do we place ourselves would be an interesting question. And I think being a follower of Jesus is deeply sobering, because it doesn't let you get away with that. Did you add anything to that?
No, but I just had a flashback to an interview question I once had as a junior doctor, when they asked me where did I see myself in my class, the level.
Oh yeah.
And I really had no idea, but I just put myself pretty high. And I got the job.
Well, it's funny that one of my
whether it was true or not.
One of my friends, my friend's an illustration that he's used for years, so it's not original to me, but it's quite helpful. He says, well, if you imagine a warehouse, the biggest warehouse in the world. If you've seen Indiana Jones and the Raiders of the Lost Ark, that place they stashed the Ark at the end of that movie, huge warehouse full of shelves. And on these shelves are the photographs of every human being who's ever lived. All of you are in there, everybody else is in there, the whole of human existence. And those shelves are the height of the shelf relates to morality. So, the most amazing people in human history who've ever lived. Think of, Mother Teresa, Florence Nightingale, and a few others are up there. Top shelf, absolute, top shelf. Next shelf down, we've got, people who are national heroes, people who have done really good things, but perhaps on a more national basis. Middle shelf, you're now getting into ordinary people. People you'd be proud to have as your friends, salt of the earth types, not particularly special, but, decent people. People you'd lend your car to, that kind of thing. Next shelf down, now we're getting into the slightly dubious, slightly dodgy end of humanity. Quite exciting people. You'd invite them to parties, you wouldn't lend them your car. Getting a bit dodgy. A bit further down, we've now got even dodgier. We've got estate agents, solicitors, politicians. And the bottom shelf, now you're looking at really vicious people who love inflicting pain on others. Dentists, for example. That bottom shelf. Now, here's the thought experiment goes. Where would you place yourself on that ranking of shelves? My friend said, what, realistically, in that thought experiment, we probably all do. You look around. Oh, sorry, no, this is it. Sorry, I've almost got the punchline wrong. He said, imagine God's going to draw a line of judgment on that shelf. Everyone above the line of judgment goes to heaven. Everyone below the line of judgment goes to hell. That's the idea. Sorry, I had that slightly wrong. Now, where does God draw that line? And my friend Mike used to say, let's be honest, what we all do. We don't admit it, but this is what we all do. We figure out which shelf are we on, and we draw the line just underneath. Because obviously me and everybody up, clearly going to heaven, everybody else going to the other place. But what if God is going to draw a line of judgment on that shelf, but it doesn't run this way? What if the line runs that way? And on one side, you have the people, no matter where they stand on the shelf, who have realized that actually, however good they are, it isn't good enough, and however bad they are, it isn't too bad for God. But all of them need God's love and mercy and forgiveness in Christ. And on the other side are people who've gone, actually, I will handle it myself. Thank you, God, I don't need your help. What if the line of judgment runs that way and not that way? And that, in a nutshell, is the message of the gospel.
Thank you. One more written question here.
Written question?
And it picks up the idea of justice, which you've alluded to already. It's a particular scenario. It's I suppose. Let me put it like this: it's, you know, if we see younger people dying, and we ourselves have survived perhaps into old age, and it's kind of questioning the fairness or the justice of that. How can that be just for somebody to live to an old age and maybe into a nursing home, and for someone to I mean, I think the way the question was worded, sometimes people say that there was more for the survivor to do. You know, God had more for the person, but doesn't really answer the question why the young person didn't survive and have more to do.
I'm glad as you were talking about younger people, you're looking at me, James. I deeply appreciate
well, you are
that.
younger than I am.
we figured that out considerably, isn't it?
Yeah.
I won't dig any further. Yeah, I think when we were talking about this question earlier, and I was saying, I think what fascinates me about this question is that in one sense I've sort of experienced it, you know, sort of personally, not personally, but personally in the last few years, because a very, very dear friend of mine, about 3-4 years ago, maybe 5 years ago, COVID messes with your head, died of cancer in his early 30s. He was diagnosed with stage 4 stomach cancer, was dead within a year. His name was Nabeel Qureshi. Some of you who are Christians in the room may know that name. Nabeel was very famous because he was a very, very committed Muslim, became a Christian after a 5-year kind of search and really in-depth examination of Christianity and Islam. And then wrote a best-selling book, New York Times best-selling book, sold, I think now it's sold 500,000 copies, his autobiography, which is called Seeking Allah, Finding Jesus. And I know personally of dozens of Muslims who, you know, came to faith in Jesus through that book, and I think the estimate worldwide, thousands of people influenced by that book. And I know many of us who were friends of Nabeel when he died were like, you know, I remember praying, God, what are you doing? I mean, you got another 50 years, and think of the impact he could have. On the other hand, a couple of weeks ago, I had a reunion from a youth group I was in 40 years ago. A whole bunch of us got together.
You're not that young, really.
Well, I was 3 when I went, and well played. And 40 years ago, when I was 9, so you can do the maths. This is the big year for me. And but there was one of my former youth leaders, who, funnily enough, was also my dentist. So bottom shelf. And there's Alan, 95. And, you know, lovely guy. I'm not wishing he wasn't alive, by the way, but the contrast between someone who has lived into absolute ripe old age and somebody who died young. I'm going to begin by saying I don't know. I'm not going to sit in front of you and go, oh yeah, I know why you know some die and some and some don't. In fact, it's funny. I'm just reading doing my annual pilgrimage through Lord of the Rings, and there's that line about, you know, the young die and the old linger. On the words of Theoden in the Two Towers. I don't know why that happens sometimes. What I do know is this: God is not caught out by any of the surprise of this broken world we live in. You know, God wasn't sitting up there in heaven going, Struth, Nabeel Qureshi's got cancer. Bam, what do I do? We had plans, Gabriel. We had plans for a world tour. He's going to die, man. What are we going to do? God is not surprised by that. And nor does God look down at my, you know, former youth leader, Alan Vogt, and go, oh man, Alan's still here. Fantastic. Let's find something for him to do. God doesn't need us. God chooses graciously to work through us, and some of us are blessed with long life, some of us aren't. I don't fully know the reason as to why some aren't and some others, other than, as I say, I think whether God uses us for a short while or a long while, it's amazing. That God shows any interest at all in us is amazing, because we can actually offer nothing to him at all whatsoever, and that he chooses to offer welcome and acceptance into his family to both young and old is incredible. But as to the whys and wherefores of particular lives, I genuinely do not know the answer to that question. I would be utterly foolish if I claimed to.
Now, folks, it's just about 8:30. We've gone past 8:30, so now's your chance. Yes, Terry.
Oh,
Yep.
yes, we'll get a microphone to you. Fire away, Terry.
Why haven't more Jews converted? Has God given up on his people?
Oh, gosh, there's a nice big theological question, Terry. Thank you for that. Let me begin with the end. No, I don't think he has. And I think if you read the New Testament, you see the love that God has for his people writ large all over it. And we also can forget, of course, that Christianity was, when it began, a profoundly Jewish movement. Jesus was a Jew. Most of the first Christians were Jewish. And particularly the Apostle Paul is interesting, the man who, through whom God wrote, a good, massive chunk of the New Testament. You read, in the book of Romans, particularly the love that Paul has for his fellow Jewish people. Nowhere does Paul turn around and go, oh, well, stuff a lot of them. The love that he has comes through. So it's certainly not the latter. There are more Jewish believers than you might realize, I think, sometimes. I have had the privilege of meeting many. There are quite a lot of books written by them. There are websites with testimonies. In fact, I've had the huge privilege of coming to know over the years, one or two Messianic Jews, and it's amazing, because in one sense, I sort of feel they've almost got the whole show. They understand the Old Testament, much more richly than I ever have, and they, fully understand what it means that Jesus is Messiah. Do I wish there were more of them? Yes, I do. I think there's a couple of things going on, not the only reasons, but a couple of things. Or maybe three. I tend to think in threes. I tell you, I was a Baptist, and we think in threes, usually starting with the same letter. Remember that Judaism today, a good number of folks who are Jews today, it's become a political and ethnic identity more than a religious one. You'll meet secular Jews. My wife had a colleague a few years ago who was, if you asked her, she'd say, I'm Jewish, but actually what that meant to her, it was just the ethnicity. She wasn't practicing. And that's a huge number. And that gets complicated when we think about, the nation of Israel. The geopolitical nation of Israel is not, God's people. It's a political nation state. So that complicates things. So I think there's that issue. A lot of Jews have adopted Judaism. And many Jews are atheistic, which you sort of think when you first come across that, you think, how does that work? Well, it's become an ethnic identity for some, not for all. Secondly, I think some of the history of what's happened with the Jewish people hasn't helped. And I think Christians need to be willing to put our hands in our hearts and say some of the ways that the church historically has treated and engaged with our Jewish friends hasn't exactly helped. If you are a Jew and you won't be tempted to consider Jesus, but you have been, mistreated by the church and by those acting in the name of Christ, that is going to be a huge damage to witness. And I think that hasn't helped either. And then, of course, I think more recently, in recent years, I think the damage that World War II and the Holocaust and the great evils experienced there have done, I know that caused many Jewish people to raise profound questions about God in general that I have every sympathy for. And it's some amazing sort of Jewish writing reflecting on that. So I think there's a whole series of factors. But God is at work among Jews today. I have every opportunity when I meet Jewish people, I'll do my best to share with them the good news of who Jesus is. Yeah. If someone becomes, that's a great question, Terry, and the same applies to Islam. Actually, I mentioned Nabeel Qureshi, my former Muslim friend. When he became a follower of Jesus, that cost him his family. At that point, that cost him his family. I have many former Muslim friends who are now Christians. The same can happen sometimes, not as much, but can happen in Judaism. What I say to that is a couple of things. Firstly, that's not a surprise because Jesus predicted that would happen. Jesus sort of famously said, I've come to turn, father against son, mother against daughter, meaning that if people chose him, for some it would mean their families would then turn against them. That would be the cost, is the first thing. Secondly, I mentioned to a previous answer, I think one of the things I'm very struck by is for those of us in this room who are followers of Jesus, living in a Western liberal democracy like Scotland, it's quite cost-free to be a Christian. Be a Christian if you come from another background. Judaism, Islam. In fact, I had a friend some years ago whose wife was a Jehovah's Witness, and when she and her mother left the JWs, similar thing happened. Absolute ostracization. And that I'm hugely impressed when people are willing to pay that price, because Jesus did say, "Take up your cross and follow me." And it's a good question for those of us in this room who would say we are followers of Jesus. What's the price that we've paid? And if we haven't paid one, do we need to ask ourselves some questions? But yeah, to those from the Jewish, or for those of any other faith, but particularly those for whom there's a cost, I think we treat them with the utmost respect, generosity, and be willing, if they choose to follow Christ and their implications, then be willing to open up our homes and welcome them in. That's what happened to Nabeel. For a long time, he lived with Christians until eventually, hallelujah, the relationships with his family were healed almost towards the end before he died.
Maybe just one last question, and then so you're not rushing off.
No, we're not rushing off.
You're in, even if you.
And there are cupcakes as well.
There are cupcakes over here. So if you do want to ask Andy a question personally, then please do that. So.
Or James, instantly, he is happy to answer questions. He's very modest, but hang on.
What's manna house? What does it mean? And we said, well, manna was the Jews in the wilderness, and we gave them a Bible.
Brilliant.
And come back and we'll explain it to you. Is that enough? Does that count?
What a brilliant question. I didn't catch your name. I'm not sure. I'm not sure I'd use the phrase count or not count. I think evangelism simply means the idea of bearing witness to who Jesus is follow Jesus as you obviously are. You want to be his ambassador. You want to introduce other people to him, and that looks different for every single one of us. For David in the workplace, for myself or James in more public ministry, for others here. So I would simply say evangelism to me begins with looking at the opportunities that God brings across your path, praying daily actually that God would bring people across your path, and then as best you can in a way that fits you and your personality, responding in the light of that. And yeah, absolutely, if there's an opportunity to give somebody the gift of the Bible, that works really well. A good follow-up for a future one might be to say, hey, would you like to come back for a coffee sometime and we can look at it together? Offering to pray with people. I have a friend in Oxford who has built a very effective, way of sharing Jesus with people. He just has a table on the street with a sign saying prayer offered. And that would sound, how could that work? Well, actually the answer is, turns out people love that offer, and he's had numerous opportunities just through literally sitting at a little table with a sign saying prayer available. So yeah, for you, absolutely. We are all called. I think you read the Bible, the New Testament, we are all commanded to share our faith in Christ with others, but we are not all commanded to do it the same way. So yeah, look at the opportunities God has given you and step into them. And yeah, I pray that God works through it.
I think we have a couple of questions. Well, okay. See how they are.
Yeah. Oh, very good.
For many people today, macroevolution
yes
is a fact,
and
therefore creation is a fallacy, and therefore the Bible can't be trusted. And they look at people who believe in the God of creation and recreation as imbeciles. Answer.
Thank you. So I was just like, if there's anything you wish to add to that. Well, I'd say a couple of things straight away. I mean, I remember it was a short while before lockdown began, I was doing a university event when it came to the Q&A, where where somebody, raised their hand. I think they self-identified as an atheist. I think they led with that. And they said, well, what about evolution then? And I remember my answer was, what about evolution? Which was interesting because they hadn't got a follow-up to that. And what I said is a couple of things, firstly. And when I come across people, as you described there, there's two approaches I would take. One is I would say, well, let's put the whole evolution and biology piece to one side, just for a moment. If the evolutionary story, macroevolution, as you put it, the idea that everything's come from a common ancestor, over billions of years by random mutation and natural selection, of course, that requires quite a lot. People sort of smuggle that into the room as if that's a great ta-da. Well, hang on a minute. We need a universe where there's stable chemistry and physics and all kinds of things. Okay, so let's now talk about why there is any stuff in the first place. Why is there any atoms or particles or material in the universe for evolution to act upon in the first place? Because by far the bigger question is why there is something rather than nothing. And that's a strong place to begin for a couple of reasons. Firstly, I don't think science can touch that question. Science tells you how stuff behaves, doesn't tell you why there's stuff in the first place. And that's a massive issue. And trying to answer that has tied many atheists up in knots. Lawrence Krauss, the famous 1% bitter pollution guy who I quoted earlier, he actually wrote a book called Universe from Nothing, in which he attempts to explain how you can get a universe from nothing. And it turns out his idea of nothing is quite busy. Nothing is a universe of subatomic particles and laws and things jiggling about and all over the place. And he basically concludes that nothing is a kind of something, and therefore is not a problem. I always said after reading that book, I was tempted to try that out on our next wedding anniversary, not to get my wife anything for our wedding anniversary. When she complains, to go, but honey, nothing is actually a kind of something. Professor Krauss said so.
Yeah.
Don't think it's going to fly.
No.
And actually, this is a massive issue. And you, basically, as an atheist, you actually effectively, I mentioned Glenn Scrivener, our mutual friend earlier. Glenn has this nice line where he says, the virgin birth of Jesus or the virgin birth of the universe. You choose your miracle. You really are, as an atheist, stuck at this point. So I would consider Ross doing an end run around evolution. Evolution gets people bogged down when there are much bigger, massively bigger questions in the room. Second thing that's so strong on this issue is people forget, because they have short memories, that for most of the history of science, in fact most of human history, people believe the universe had always been here. We now believe in the Big Bang and a beginning to space-time. That really only came into play the beginning of the 20th century. Up until the early 20th century, even eminent scientists thought the universe had always been here. And then along comes Albert Einstein with his new general theory of relativity, looks at the equations and the maths he's working on, realizes it gives him a universe that's expanding. The problem is, if a universe is expanding, it must have once had a beginning. Einstein, bless him, concludes, well, that can't possibly be right. We know the universe has always been here, and he literally fudges his maths to give himself a stable universe. He introduces something called the cosmological constant to give him a stable universe. He later described that as the biggest blunder of his entire scientific career. Later, as more experiments are done, more observation is done, particularly in the 1960s when what's called the cosmic microwave background radiation, the echoes of the Big Bang basically are discovered. Suddenly science realizes that actually there was a beginning. And in fact, the term Big Bang is an insult. It was a term coined by the atheist cosmologist Fred Hoyle, who hated the idea that there was a beginning because he saw the consequences theologically, and he saw this ridiculous Big Bang idea. And so I say to atheists today, the book of Genesis, which several thousand years before has God creating the beginning, it was rather ahead of the game, wasn't it? So I don't think Christians have anything to be embarrassed about in terms of origins, first thing. So very seriously, I would do a bit of an end run around evolution. When it comes to evolution, what I would then say to atheists, if they want to then come back to it, is to go, there are actually a variety of positions that Christians take with regard to evolution. It is perfectly theologically possible that God chose to work through the process of evolution, and there are Christians who hold that position. One of the most eminent microbiologists in the world, Francis Collins, who headed up a project called the Human Genome Project, that first cracked the human DNA sequence, committed Christian, fundamentally committed Christian, believes the book of Genesis is scripture, but also believes that God worked through the process of evolution. It is not either or. And Christians hold a range of views on that. And I would often recommend people to read Francis's book, because he became a Christian at university. And actually, what's interesting when you look back historically, when Darwin first comes up with the idea of evolution, most of his supporters are Christians, because before it got weaponized as a weapon in the atheist Christianity debate, most of the early Christians, you can find when Darwin first comes up with it, see it as a wonderful sign of God's incredible creativity. Because rather than just go pop, 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 and God create individual things, God designs this incredible system that unfolds over time to give us the creation that we see. And when you say you believe in creation, by the way, that's not committing you to evolution or not evolution. It's simply saying that you believe behind the universe that there is a creator. So I think it's hugely important as Christians we define some terms, we go back to the very beginning, and we don't let our atheist friends run away with the idea, well, it's evolution or God. It isn't. That's an absolute nonsense. It's scientific lunacy to say anything that daft. And I won't let my secular friends get away with it. And to say, Francis Collins' book, The Language of God, it maps that position out. Now, you don't have to adopt that position as a Christian. There are other positions you can take, but it's a perfectly respectable one. I hope that helps a little bit. I know there's a lot in there, but it was a big question, Ross, so thank you. Aye.
Yep.
Yes,
so
that's what I do.
asking about books, recommended books, so we can pass that on.
We can do. He does read the occasional book.
I think, folks, we should call it a day there in terms of this kind of public setting. But to say, there's tea and coffee and cakes, and Andy will be here if you want to ask a question individually. Then let's do that. But I think it's also worth showing our appreciation, Andy, for fielding so many and such a variety of questions. So thank you for that. And just to let you know that Andy will be speaking at the Clonduffel Christian Centre on Saturday morning on confident Christianity, really geared for Christians to how to explain their faith, particularly coming up to Easter and post-COVID. Then on Sunday, he'll be back here, the morning service at 11 a.m., speaking on Jesus and the failures of the church, which in some ways is a good topic to have, even as we give thanks for our 10th anniversary. And then on Sunday evening, I think it's at 5:30 at Smithton, be speaking on war and peace, which he tells me is not going to be a commentary on Tolstoy's novel, but on the whole subject, very relevant today on war and peace. So thank you again, Andy. And folks, if you're able to stay, tea and coffee and water here and biscuits and cakes. So thank you. And thank you to Callum for doing the sound. Thank you.